Thank you, Carl, and I'm honored to be invited to do this lecture. I'm Lisa Österling from Stockholm University in Sweden, and I have been asked by Lee to participate in this project due to our common interest in practicum in teacher education. So Lee, I think most of you know her. She's an associate professor in University of the Witwatersrand in South Africa, Johannesburg. And we have previously done research on assessment rubrics in teacher education. And this project is about talking about assessment rubrics with the help of LCT. So next slide, please, Lee. Yes, so we first will talk about a bit of our data, the background of using practicum assessment rubrics in teacher education. We talk about practicum as the part where student teachers go to schools to do field experiences or practice teaching or student teaching. It has a few different names internationally, but we call it practicum here. And we use the tools that teachers use to assess this part of teacher education. So that will be the first part. And thereafter, we will move into the LCT theories and look for the focus of assessment and the basis of legitimation. And at the end, we will talk about the implications of the study, because both Lee and I find that LCT helps us to talk about important aspects of the messages provided by those tools that can teach us much about epistemic access in teacher education. Please, Lee.
Right, thank you. So we think that practicum teaching experience assessment rubrics are really significant for us as teacher educators. The first thing is that they're used repeatedly. So it's the same rubric for all students in an institution or in a program. They are used by a whole range of mentor teachers and lecturers. In our institution, for example, we've got about 2,500 student teachers who go to about 600 schools at a time, each one of them with a lecturer, each one of them with a teacher mentor. And so they are extensively used. As the students go through their teacher education program, they go to different schools in different years of study. So they're used over different contexts. And they used when they're a first-year student, second-year student, third-year student, fourth-year students. So they're also used at different stages of their development as teacher trainees. So they are used repeatedly in very, very high stakes assessment. There are many institutions, ours is one, that if you do not pass your practicum, you don't pass the year. So, you know, that informs the progression through teacher education. But at the end of the qualification, you've got to pass your practicum in order to graduate as a teacher. And in South Africa, it also depends on your professional registration. You may not register to teach as a professional teacher and be employed if you haven't passed your practicum. So the students take this seriously. And so what I'm saying here is that we're looking at these documents as a condensation of the intended learning and the goals of teacher education. A major part is to prepare them for classroom practice. And so they really show what is valued by each institution, or sometimes they're national ones, by each country, about what matters and what student teachers need to do in the classroom, be in the classroom, know in the classroom in order to qualify. We're going to draw on a couple of the tools from LCT. The first one that I'm going to just introduce is the constellations, which draws an analogy between groups of ideas or groups of beliefs, values, dispositions, and the stars that we put together to form pictures. And so a constellation is understood as a selected grouping that appears to have coherence from a particular point in space and time to a particular group of actors. We think that this is a really interesting way of looking at the practicum assessment rubrics, because they've been designed by teacher educators in their institutions, and they've pulled together those attributes, those concepts, those strategies that they want to see enacted in the students' practice during their school in their practicum. So we're going to be looking in a couple of places at constellations, clusters of meaning that are connected. The one thing that I'm just wanting to show you here is that you could have a cluster of actions that, or behaviors that can be condensed into dispositions. And those dispositions, a cluster of them, could be condensed even further into ethics. Another way of portraying this, and I'm drawing on Eleanor Lambrinos's study of ballet, is how, again, a cluster of behaviors could be condensed into a cluster of dispositions, which could be condensed into ethics. So those are some of the representations that we're going to use. We're also going to draw on the specialization dimension of LCT, which asks the questions, what matters for achievement? And there's a distinction made between epistemic relations and social relations. So a practice is always directed towards something. In the case of this study, it's the practice of teaching that's directed into enabling learning in particular environments. And then that sets up epistemic relations between the knowledge and the strategies for teaching and the practice itself. But there's always people who are enacting those practices. And so there are social relations too, which are going to refer to the dispositions, the beliefs, the ethical orientations, the values of the student teachers who are learning to become knowers of the practice of teaching.
We've been using practicum assessment tools from 5 different countries, and you can see them represented here on the map. And these we have most, as you can see, from South Africa, and that is sort of interesting because when we talk about those constellations, we can see both big differences, but the differences do not necessarily go between nations, but the differences are almost as big within South Africa as between the different nations, and we will return to that. And in an important acknowledgement to make is that these tools have been researched previously by Lee in the ITERP project in South Africa, and with me and my colleagues Iben and Kiki, who are here online with us, in the TRACE project in Stockholm University in Sweden. So this is a follow-up study using LCT on the same instruments as has been researched previously. And before turning to the constellations, we engaged all the different criteria from these assessment rubrics, and we addressed them through a thematic analysis to find the focus of assessment. So we looked for dispositions that were valued, what pre-service teachers need to know or understand, what they need to do, and whether, when it comes to doing, whether it is a discernment or reasoning involved, or whether there is merely a compliance to follow rules that is valued. So before we turn to LCT, we made a rather classic but rather extensive thematic analysis of all the different criteria. You can see some examples here, even though the text is very small.
Okay, so the first thing that we're going to speak about is what do they need to know? What knowledge, awareness, or understanding is privileged or valued in these across these tools. So where I've got it in blue, that's where there's a very, very strong consensus across many of the instruments. Where I've got it in gray, it was significant in a couple, but it wasn't prevalent overall. So the first cluster of ideas is in the importance of content knowledge. And again, I'm drawing on the way that Elena Lambrinos has represented the constellations in her doctoral study. So this was quite fascinating that across all the instruments, strong content knowledge was required as a group. And what was valued in terms of the content knowledge? Well, it had to be accurate, it had to be comprehensive, it had to be organized, it had to be linked to examples, and it had to be clearly explained by the student teacher. So that was one huge point of convergence over all these instruments. The next cluster that we noticed about what pre-service teachers need to know and understand was in terms of policy documents. So it was prevalent across all of them that policy and even national frameworks, constitutions, statutory frameworks had to be understood. There was a bit of a constellation clash because whereas some of them talked about understand and implement, others were understand and interpret in relation to your context and your needs. So there was a difference there. The third point of consensus across all the instruments was about having a knowledge of the students who you're teaching. And what was valued in there was that a knowledge of learning difficulties, their prior knowledge, and being respectful and knowing about the diversities that were in the class. All of those were really, really important in terms of informing pedagogy. So, you know, teach according to their prior knowledge, teach according to their learning difficulties and their diversities. What was less prevalent was the context in which the learners came from and how that was important in terms of informing pedagogy and selecting resources. So in terms of what pre-services teachers need to be aware of, to understand and know, we saw three clusters.
And the next constellation is what pre-service teachers need to do, and there was a lot here. And I think this can be explained since some of the protocols, not all, but some of them are used to observe teaching. And when teaching is observed, it is mostly what teachers do that can be observed. It's more difficult to actually observe knowledge. So there were a large number of tasks. So the constellation here should be huge. It's not, we could elaborate more on it, but what we could see is that there are a lot of tasks that teachers need to manage. It's often expressed like that, to manage different range of tasks. And the task could be different teaching strategies or using different resources, but the majority of tasks considered relations with learners or learning. So it could be learning as assessment, managing learning, monitoring learning. It could be monitoring learners' behaviors, learners' work, but also, as Lee could see in knowledge, it also had a big focus on encouragement and learners' well-being. So we could really see that teachers were expected to engage. An important task for teachers were to make their learners feel well in the classroom and to engage in their learning.
Okay, so what I'm going to do now is to then look at the dispositions, what kind of behavior, what kind of dispositions and what kind of ethics. And I'm going to do a little bit of condensation there from clusters of behavior to dispositions and where they exist onto ethical orientations of the practice. They don't always condense in that way, but sometimes they do. And we picked up several clusters of dispositions, and we've grouped them. So the first was dispositions in relation to knowledge. And so there were behaviors such as, you know, making sure that one's well informed and is consulting many resources, taking initiative to go and find those resources. And these clustered into dispositions, being confident in the classroom, being passionate and being enthusiastic. Now, it was implied that that comes from a confidence in your content knowledge, but it wasn't always directly said. Sometimes it was implicitly said, and sometimes it's very explicitly said. What was very interesting for me is that nowhere in any of the rubrics was curiosity or being inquisitive mentioned as an attribute of teachers that is valued. So we've got this, the teacher must be confident.
Can I just ask, that's in something where they're saying this is a desired outcome, not something they're trying to assess.
Exactly.
Right?
So yeah, so it is all, yeah. Yeah. That's right.
Okay, so yeah, so they do want to see confident, passionate, enthusiastic, but it's not always explicitly tied to their content knowledge. So the next, and then that of course didn't go into ethics. It was left as a collection of dispositions. The next cluster of ideas, or the clusters of dispositions and behaviors that we looked at, related to the way that they engage with students. And we see lots of times where the teacher needs to be encouraging and motivating and controlling. There was only a couple that said that they need to demand respect and be controlling. So that was also a kind of a constellation clash there. Many of the others were encouraging, motivating, which then condensed into dispositions of being kind and caring and friendly and empathetic towards learners. Those don't condense into the ethic of respecting diversity. The respecting of diversity is really linked more to the knowledge, you know, being aware of the children's diversity and so on. But it did come through as a very, very strong ethical orientation that needed to permeate, it permeated nearly all of the assessment rubrics that we looked at. The next cluster of dispositions were in terms of what we've called their professional interactions with colleagues and with the profession more widely. So this included things like being punctual, being suitably attired. It condensed into dispositions like being reliable, being collegial, being cooperative. And that condensed into ethics about being honest and trustworthy. There was something quite fascinating that we saw in the data, and that was that 2 of the rubrics stressed being loyal and obedient and respectful to authority, whereas others were foregrounding being agents of social justice and challenging marginalization practices and so on. So we have this extreme of the kind of upholding the system as it is and challenging what may not be working. So that was an interesting one to notice.
Excuse me, Lee.
Yes.
It's Sarah.
Sarah.
I'm sorry to ask you, but you know the knowledge triangle. Can you explain, because I'm not very clever, about why it doesn't have a top?
Okay, so the way that's a really good question.
That's a good question.
The way that I understood this is that an ethical orientation is the way that you interact with other people, or the way that you whereas so if one's looking at one's own knowledge, it's not really about interacting with others, it's about something. So the condensation that we saw went up to disposition, but it didn't have an ethical peak. Whereas the interactions with the way that you treat students and the interactions with your peers and the profession more broadly, that did have a peak, if that makes sense.
Yep, completely.
Okay, the one thing that I did spend a lot of time thinking is whether, because we know that in the teacher education literature, there's lots about an ethic of care. And so whether that care should be moved up to the ethical space, but I wasn't sure about that. Don't know if anybody wants to.
Could ethics not also include the content that's included in the class? So if you're addressing issues, and I suppose, sorry, at that level, sustainability, social justice, or anything like that could be seen as including ethical knowledge.
Mm. Yeah. So
Exactly.
what we do here are sorry. Lisa, you go.
It's really interesting because it reasons also with Carl's question there that this is what we actually saw in the protocols. And it could be really interesting to discuss why isn't there an ethical dimension to knowledge visible in those rubrics. So what we did was more of a critical approach to the rubrics to see what is it that becomes condensed as knowledge in those rubrics. And what this triangle demonstrates to me is that while knowledge does not condense all the way up to the ethical level, and it's not that we don't want it to be that way, it's more like right now it is not visible in the 9 rubrics we included. It would be really interesting to discuss what it could be.
Ivan, did you want to ask something?
These people.
Hi Lee, it's Di Swift here. Can I come in for a moment?
Sure, and then Ivan after Diane.
So I just wonder, some of the work that I've been doing is it because certainly in the English context, the rubric is about a teacher rather than teaching as a profession. So arguably the rubric is limiting the access to the reservoir, the community of practice.
Okay, so we're going to then move in this next section about looking at to what extent the teacher is emphasized and to what extent the practice of teaching is emphasized. And you'll see how our analysis plays out in that way.
Ivan, I don't know how to say your name.
Ibn, sorry, Ibn. Yes, it's Danish. It's you got to live with that. So I live with the Ibn Ivan all the time. I want to take a step back because I'm still a little bit confused when you talk about the condensation and that you see the ethics. I'm not following how much of this is a condensation that you have performed and exactly how this condensation performs. So I'm unclear about how much is what you've seen and coded, and I know it's all interpretation, but if you could just clarify a little bit.
Yeah, I also was going to ask that as well. That's a really good point. I'm not sure what's the analysis and what's being done by the rubrics themselves, or the not rubrics, whatever the things that set out what the attributes
rubrics.
Yeah.
So these came directly from the rubrics. So whereas in some, you might have dispositions that, reliable and collegial, and others are collegial and cooperative, and others are reliable and cooperative. Then you might, in some of them, they were actually then more phrased as ethics rather than a collection of dispositions. So this isn't our words. These are all coming from the empirical data, although we then separated out what is the level of actions and behavior, what are the levels of dispositions, and where are ethical orientations of the practice mentioned.
Right, so I think what you're saying then is that what we're seeing in terms of things like taking initiative or punctual and so on, and then kind, caring and various other things, are the things that are in the rubrics, and then you've kind of organized them into this hierarchy that not everyone knows. So a PhD that's not been published, it's on the internet, but it's a sort of building off like Eleanor's work on dancers of being things people do, and then kind of ways of acting, and then kind of like much more transposable kind of dispositional, really higher, more kind of less concretely practical things much higher up, like ethics. Is that right? So when you say it's been condensed, you don't mean they then say, oh, and those things will be, the condensation isn't apparent in the actual rubrics. It's more the interpretation by assuming that the things that are mentioned as ethical are somehow gathering up and taking up into them all these things below.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think we do two things. So we try to condense some of the rubric things. So the rubrics says kind and caring, but in a whole sentence of blah 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 blah, and we take out. So that's one step of condensation. But and then as you said, we used the work of her name is Lambrinos. Yes, Elena Lambrinos to find a way of representing it.
Yeah, so I think there was just a bit of confusion that whether the rubrics themselves were actually doing the condensation. No,
some of them were. So some of them were, because they would have 4 or 5 words, but one of the words would actually be the cluster of everything else. So,
being, say, I'm making one up, but saying respecting diversity involves being kind and caring and friendly and empathetic, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So some of it would be actually explicit condensation.
So some of them were, and some of them, yeah. But so it's just the way that we organized to say that there are these clusters and they're coherent, and there is huge amounts of consensus across many of the ones that we studied.
Just as a sidebar, I had to fill out a PhD annual performance review today, in which it asked some idiotic question about, can you comment on how you have modeled or taught or something your candidate
ethical practices in research and writing. And I simply wrote, I have no idea what this question is attempting to ask me, or what it means, or how you can parse out ethical from writing. Yeah, it was just, I don't, it's like so high up and abstract as to, that's clearly ticking a box somewhere.
There is
Billy has
also.
his hand raised, yeah.
Hi, yeah, I had a comment and then a question. I thought the comment of why there wasn't an ethical dimension in knowledge might be what Lisa was originally saying, is that it's actually quite hard to observe knowledge. It's easier to observe practice than knowledge. But then my question is, I'm really interested to know in which contexts you saw students, teachers needing to be loyal and obedient.
We're going to theorize that, and we're going to show you when we get to the basis of legitimation. I think that'll become clear to you. I'm just highlighting, I'm flagging it here.
In the ethic thing with the knowledge, I wonder actually whether that's not a little bit deeper. Maybe it goes to the difference that people see in the school system between production, recontextualization, and so on. And at that level, the teacher is more go ahead and give the knowledge and build that foundation, rather than the teacher having any ethic as far as society is concerned, for actually actively producing any real form of knowledge in the classroom. If that happens, it's an accident, and I suppose we can tell it's an accident because whenever it does happen, there's a news story about it somewhere saying, chemistry student in 7th grade makes a big this, and scientists are amazed. Whereas if you do that in university lab or something, people are like, yeah, I guess they're doing their job. Good.
Okay, thanks.
I think I'm going to let Lee and Lisa move on now, although I'm just going to say as a quick note, knowledge may be a bit confusing here, because I don't think you mean knowledge. You might mean knowing.
Yeah, I think you're right. Thank you, Carl. That is correct. So this is really about what is valued in the assessment rubrics in terms of the teacher as a knower. I think that's exactly
knowing.
That's exactly knowing. Yeah. Right. The last kind of big cluster were what kind of personal growth, a cluster of dispositions. And so we, in the rubrics, we found, being open to challenges, being receptive to feedback, being willing to learn, a whole lot of things like that. And then these condensed into dispositions like being thoughtful, being flexible, being self-reflective. And again, because that is an internal thing and doesn't involve interactions with others, we didn't find many ethical orientations of the practice. So what we've done now is we've looked at the convergences, what many of them said needed, they needed to know, needed to do, and the dispositions. And those were the focus of the criteria. So the content, what they were directed to. So what I'd like to look at now is the basis of legitimation. And that's where we start to see that although they had a very similar focus, the basis of legitimation was quite different in many places. So
oh, I see. So can I just say, so you, because we kind of got lost with may have got lost with so many awesome questions, which is, so I think you were saying that you found quite a lot of consistency across all these rubrics in all these different places in terms of the knowing side of things, like the teacher, what's in their head, how they behave, what they're supposed to be as a person, and all that sort of stuff. but in terms of the labels people are using, so we want teachers to be this and that and the other. But then the basis of making those points about, so that could conceal, in a way, the fact there might be very different bases of legitimacy in these different places. Is that right?
That's exactly right. So that's what we're going to look at now, is to what extent are the epistemic relations emphasized as a basis of achievement, and to what extent are the social relations emphasized as a basis of achievement. So you'll remember we talked about practice being directed towards some part of the world and the relations between knowledge and procedures and the practice. So we've got a continuum of strengths ranging from stronger epistemic relations where they matter a lot. They emphasized as the basis of legitimation, and that's towards the top of the graph and of the semantic plane, and where they are not emphasized as the basis of legitimation, the epistemic relations are weaker, and we find that towards the bottom half of the plane. Then in terms of the social relations, this is where the knower attributes matter more or matter less as a basis of achievement. So where they matter more, where they're emphasized as the basis of achievement, we say that that's the stronger social relations, and those will be located on the right-hand side of the specialization plane. And where they matter less, or they're not emphasized as the basis of achievement, we say that they're weaker social relations, and we're going to put those on the left-hand side of the social plane. And so what this does is it sets up four analytically distinct parts of the specialization plane, and the legitimation codes give a different basis of legitimation. So where the knowledge and the procedures are emphasized as the basis of achievement, and at the same time the knower attributes are not emphasized, then we call that a knowledge code. In the bottom right-hand corner, the opposite of that, where the knowledge and the procedures are not emphasized as the basis of legitimation for that criteria, but the knower attributes are emphasized, then we say that that would be a knower code. There were hardly any examples of an elite code where both knowledge and attributes were emphasized at the same time as a basis of legitimation, but lots of places where it's relativist, where the knowledge and the procedures are not emphasized and the knower attributes are also not emphasized. And we're going to show you how this plays out in the data. So I'm setting up my translation device about exactly how we coded each one of them. So I'm going to just start off at the top in the middle, the blue epistemic relations I've done in blue, and the social relations in the reddy tones. So where specific concepts and particular procedures are mentioned by name, so things like cooperative learning strategies or formative assessment or PCK, or technical or theoretical concepts that are named, we coded that ER++, stronger epistemic relations. Where the criterion said the students need an awareness of, or knowledge of, or understanding of, then we coded that ER+. Moving to the lower half, where the knowledge and the procedures were implicit, we put that as ER-, and we noticed that those were actually a lot of places where the knowledge and the procedures were implicit was where outcomes or tasks were described, but that we'll show you a little bit later. And the ER minus minus, the weakest form of epistemic relations in our data set, were where general competences were referred to that one could learn anywhere, or where there was no emphasis at all on knowledge and procedures. So that gives us a continuum of strength for the epistemic relations. For the social relations, starting on the right-hand side, where the personal beliefs or the dispositions of the student were emphasized, we coded that as very strong social relations. So that would, you know, they were warm, they had a sense of humor, they were kind, and so on. Where they talked about practice-based dispositions or workplace manner. So these are things that are tied particularly to the workplace. We coded those as SR+. They were kind of one step removed from the person themselves. The SR-, there were many times where the disposition of the knower was not emphasized, but what it did say is that things had to be done in an appropriate way, or that they were choices needed to be relevant or meaningful or worthwhile. And there was this implication that there was some sort of discretion of the knower that was required here. We coded that SR-, and where the attributes were not significant at all, we coded that SR-, the weakest form of social relations in this data set. Lisa's going to talk about some examples.
I'll take you through a few codings. So I'll start by taking you through how we thought about 2 or 3 of them. And thereafter, I'm very happy to invite you to help to try out this coding device. So the first, we had nothing in that upper right corner. So we will put the examples there, and thereafter they will fly to their proper place in this specialization plane. So the first criteria, the teacher has a sense of humor, kind or friendly. Where would you put that kind of criteria? It goes. It goes down to the SR++. If we look at the social relations, we can see that these are quite personal beliefs or dispositions, the sense of humor, kindness, and friendliness. It says a lot about the person, about the knower. It is also on the ER scale, the ER-, because kindness and friendliness, it talks a lot about general competencies. It could be talking about the learners as well as the teachers. So it's nothing that is specific to teacher knowledge in there. So we coded this at ER-, SR++. Next one, understands the importance of giving appropriate feedback to pupils. On the ER scale, where would that go? Well, it says something about feedback to pupils. It says something about that it has to be appropriate. So, exactly, the ER+, it says something about a strategy for teaching, which is feedback. And it says something about understanding feedback. So it has to do with knowledge. But it's not very specific. It doesn't use any specific concepts, for example, for feedback. So it goes to the ER+, not the ER++. And when you look at the SR dimension, well, the word appropriate, it says that the teacher must do something more than just comply with doing this. The teacher has to do some sort of reasoning or judgment or discretion to see whether this feedback is appropriate or not. Compared to the next one. Correctly applies cooperative learning. We made a distinction between correctly and appropriate. So we would say that using something correctly on the SR scale is demands more of compliance from the teacher to do something in a particular way. Also, cooperative learning is an example of a very specific concept, which should be known by teachers. So these are a few examples of how to use this tool. Now I invite you to discuss this one. We can start by the ER scale. Questioning is clear, brief, and relevant. Is that particularly professional knowledge that goes on the plus dimension, or is it more general knowledge? Anyone wants to try?
I think it's ER minus and SR minus.
Yeah, do you agree? Yeah, why ER minus? Why would you say that? Yeah, you were correct. Mauricio, why would you suppose, why did you suggest the ER minus?
I thought because of the outcome is explicit.
Yes, yes.
But the knowledge is absolutely implicit, like it could be about anything.
It could be, exactly, it's hidden what knowledge the teachers need, but very good. The outcome is stated. So this was a quite big category actually, where the outcome could be observed in the assessment tools, in the rubrics, but the knowledge was hidden. And also it has to do some, yes, it has to be clear, brief, and relevant. So there is some discretion going on there. Thank you. Next one. Demonstrates respect for student diversity through inclusive strategies. Where does it go on the ER scale? Does it have any specific knowledge? Or unspecific?
I don't know about ER, but it's screaming SR++ to me.
It's screaming SR++ based on, why do you say that, Karen? How do you recognize it?
Sorry, I've got my wrong glasses on. Demonstrating respect.
Respect,
that's
yes.
your, yeah.
Demonstrates respect for student diversity. Yes, so it's easy on the SR+. So please, Lee, where did we put it?
We put it on SR+.
Yeah. And that we said that these that we try to make distinct categories, but sometimes it's very difficult to make the distinction. So demonstrates respect. We still thought that it says something that should be a way of enacting things rather than it says something clearly about who the knower is. So it's a bit, perhaps you can hide your true dispositions or beliefs. It doesn't ask for the teacher to be really respectful, but that is at the limit.
I'm not sure.
Okay.
I just thought it might be, I'm just trying to make sense of your coding. ER minus, that's where I would have put it below, but that's because I probably don't understand the ER minus much.
Yes, and through inclusive strategies, we still thought that there is knowledge implied in inclusive strategies. So it's more than an outcome. There is a knowledge strategy. It's not ER++ because it's not explicit. What do they need to know to make an inclusive strategy? But it implies still that there is teacher knowledge involved in inclusive strategies. It is not only the outcome.
But it depends on the inclusive strategies you're talking about. Yeah,
yes,
I know.
Yes.
So
maybe it's a kind coding. Maybe we think too much about teacher education to think that they really have knowledge about inclusive strategies. That could be different. Yes.
The strategies there weren't implicit. They were actually stated. So that was why we felt that it was stronger than the ER minus, that it did foreground. In fact, it was one of the only examples that we could actually find of an elite code where the strategy was explicit as well as the knower was emphasized.
Sorry, Robert here. Just a question. It's really about the structure of these things themselves being structuring. I'm just curious, and I've been out of LCT for a while. Has anybody used something more like numerical values, which have a larger spectrum? Because it's sometimes, I remember doing this with my work about a year ago, deciding between plus, plus, and plus. It might be a 50% difference or a 5% difference, but unless you go through the actual text of what somebody is going through the translation device, it's hard to tell where they've made that decision sometimes. And I mean, I was almost mindful to go plus, 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 you know, I'd do a triple value now, thinking, am I just pushing this too far? And I apologize if this has been done, but I'm just curious if there's been work about making the spectrum a little bit more numerical in a way. So I can see the difference between a 1 and a 5 as opposed to a plus and a plus.
Or a continuous should be an option, but inferring more discretions also involves more cases at the limit. So that's that's the thing we're working on. So one thing would be to put it on a continuous line to see how they relate to each other. Is this more SR than this one? But I don't know. Still, we wanted to try to find the patterns and about where we saw this clustering together. And of course, we have to look also in relation how did we code this among the different rubrics.
Okay.
To make comparisons within each, but it is interesting. Of course, you feel sometimes that this is really at the limit, so we should need an extra category. But the problem with more categories is that there will be even more things at the limit. And it's also hard to really make a translation device that describes the limits explicitly enough. So this was the thing we really tried to distinguish between, is it really SR++ when it is sort of within the person, with the person's own beliefs, with the knower's own beliefs and dispositions, or is it something that can be demonstrated, that could be workplace manner, but where it's more weakly related to the knower. So these categories also involves the things that we actually were interested in distinguishing between. Yeah.
Well, I'm not very sure.
Can I just ask it, Shoba? Okay.
Hi, Shoba.
Hi. Thanks. Very fascinating. I like the example to help us kind of contextualize. I'm trying to respond to the point about having more numerical or more variation in the differentiation, and I'm wondering whether that is could be dependent on the magnitude or the amount of data being used. So if we're looking at 9 rubrics and we're going to create 5 differentiations, then the implications of that result is hard to kind of make, you know, different specific points on. But if you have 1,000, then you might want to differentiate. The other concern I have is that I found that even if you go with, you know, 5 options, sometimes you'll be, oh, it's actually a 4.5. So how do we, I take the point that if you have just 2, it's more difficult and you have more in-betweens, but I feel like there are in-betweens, and I'm actually asking for clarity whether how many data sources we are using impacts on or influences to some degree the amount of variation that will be realistic. Thanks.
Before you answer that, there's a whole bunch of people wanting to make comments or ask questions, so I'm going to just let them bounce through them. So and then gather them up, and we can always you can always also shove questions into a future topic. Like, for example, how many you need is something that I can talk to at another time. But so Professor Yi first.
Oh, thank you, Carl. So I have a question about you know, categorizing. Questioning is clear, brief, and relevant. In the lower in the lower left box, because as I said, questioning is a strategy, is a kind of strategy. And so if I were to put it, I would, you know, I would categorize it as ER plus and SR plus, because it does set, you know, a specific standard for evaluating questioning strategies. So I'm not very sure that you should put it in the relatives code. So that's my question. Thank you.
Make a note of that,
good
Liz,
question,
from
because...
Lee. I'm going to jump, as I said, I'm going to jump through several questions at once. So make a note of that on a piece of paper or whatever. Jennifer, do you have a quick comment question?
Yes, I have a quick question. If you had demonstrates respect for student diversity and inclusive beliefs, where would that move to? Because
right, make a note of that, and then we'll get onto that one. And Ibn?
I was just wondering if in any way your SR scale is related to the gazes.
Okay, we've got 3 awesome questions there. Do you want to tackle any of those? And also there was Shobra as well. So, and you can also lay off a question to the future. You don't have to answer them all.
Okay, let me start. We worked with different categories for, maybe 10 different versions of strengths of ER and SR until we found one that really worked well with all of our data. So this is not a summary of what we found. We're going to go on to the numerical analysis of what was in each of the assessment rubrics after this. This is just to kind of show you an example of where we would have coded things in particular ways. So the numerical analysis is coming later. In terms of how many do you need, we carried on until we could code everything in all of our rubrics. So we needed one system of strengths of ER and one system of strengths of SR that worked across all the rubrics that we had. So yeah, these are not, these are just examples of where, just to give you a sense of how we coded our data. In terms of the questioning is clear and brief and relevant, it didn't emphasize the knowledge of questioning or understanding questioning strategies. It was more about doing the questioning, and the knowledge and the procedures were more implicit. So yes, of course, there's knowledge in questioning, but as a basis of achievement, it was less explicit than the knowledge, understanding the importance of questioning or being aware of that, which we would have foregrounded the knowledge. Let me stop there, Lisa. Do you want to carry on?
No, about inclusive beliefs, I don't know. We have to look at that. And about gazes, I think we talked about gazes. It's not of course, it informed our thinking. For example, where the personal beliefs and dispositions are very close to a born gaze. Yes, that comes with it.
What we're going to argue is that all these messages shape the knower gaze over time. And I think so we are building up to an argument of these instruments as being quite important for shaping how students come to understand practice.
Should we go for that? Go for it. Let's move. Let's get into that.
Yes.
All right.
So we'll skip the rest of the examples and go to the results, let's say.
Okay, so that was just to give you a sense of how we were using the instrument.
And how difficult it is.
Okay.
And the next one, yes. So what we did, we took each rubric and put dots for each, 1 dot for each criteria like this on the plane. And after that, next animation B, we coded it in purple. We mixed the yellow, not the yellow, the red and the blue to make purple, and the stronger the purple, the stronger the code in this part of the plane. So next one. And from this, we started working with patterns in the different results, and we will present 3 patterns we saw emerging. And here you can see, if you look, for example, at South Africa, you can see that all 3 patterns are present in the same country. So this is not suitable as a comparison between countries. It is rather what becomes legitimized in the different protocols, and how we can see at what the teachers should be, or what the teachers should know in terms of specialization codes. So we will talk about the first pattern of the task-oriented teacher, which is one example here. And what can we see when we look at this? First, we see that there is little explicit knowledge. If you remember the ER++, we saw very few examples of specific knowledge, and we were quite severe, as you could see. Perhaps someone knows that questioning was an important content in this particular teacher program, but we wanted it to be clear that this was kind of knowledge that was talked of in terms of knowledge. And next, we saw the big focus here on the practice-based outcomes, very much a description of teachers' tasks, what teachers need to do in the classroom. And more. We saw also, yes, general competences, not always specific competences, but we saw many descriptions in this pattern of general competences, as being on time, as being friendly, as being efficient, and these kind of things.
We also saw ways that the message of being task-orientated wasn't just confined to the criteria and how they were expressed. They were also in how the rubrics were structured, could send messages of a teacher's work is about doing tasks. So the kind of rubrics that were structured that we felt sent this kind of message was also in this kind of form, where you've got, in this case, five categories, ranging from good to poor or unsatisfactory. In some rubrics, it was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. In others, it was A, B, C, D, E. In others, it was percentages. And basically, there's no real sense of what constitutes excellence, what constitutes satisfactory, what constitutes average. And the discretion of the assessor is there to go and see how well he or she thinks that these tasks are being done. Many, many tasks are listed. There were more criteria of tasks in the rubrics that we felt gave a very strong message of the task-oriented teacher than any of the others. Many of them began with verbs. The teachers got to demonstrate or formulate or implement whatever it was. And we found that for the vast majority of them, there was some kind of arithmetic weighting. So, you need to demonstrate this, and that has a weighting of 10 or 5 or whatever it was. And then those are added up. And then the final percentage of the student is given by this arithmetic sum of whatever scores they've got against each one of the tasks. So what's the message that the rubric is sending? Teaching is about mastering the parts. You know, a collection of activities that one needs to do, and you get assessed on each one of those, and that then gives you the practice. So the practice is made up of components. So that was a strong message that we got of those kind of rubrics. It's very different messages in the next group of rubrics.
And as you could see, it was a Canadian example, yes, but I don't think it's typical for Canada in any ways. It's just one example, and it happened to be from Canada. And this one happens to be from the UK, and I am not sure it is typical of the UK. But in this example, we saw many things pointing to a compliant teacher. For example, if you look at the left-hand column, it has a lot of focus on the SR minus minus. And the SR minus minus, if you remember, it was where attributes of the knower were not significant, but also where there were clear instruction on how things should be implemented. So it was about implementation, compliance, and participation. Just be on time, for example. There were also some discretion where among these teachers to make decisions on themselves. But when you look at what it was about, the next thing. Yes, when it came to the knowledge dimension, there were technical terms, but many of them came from policy frameworks. So in these kinds of examples, the compliant teacher, when the knowledge was on the plus side, it was there was a dominance of knowledge retrieved from policy frameworks, knowledge about curriculum, knowledge about policy and policy implementation, rather than policy interpretation. So the compliant teacher, yes, we also found many examples of loyalty, obedience, respect for authority, and upholding national values, which was part of the SR++ disposition. So even though that goes to the totally opposite side of the SR dimension, it still speaks a language of being compliant. So on the one hand, do as we say, and on the other hand, be loyal. So it also it talks both to the teacher as someone who complies with rules and follows the rules of the system, and on the other hand, it talks to a teacher who is loyal to the system and respect the authorities. Oh yes, and general competence, as in the last one. You can see that there are more focus on general competences than on the specific teaching competences. Mm-hmm.
So this message of compliance also manifested in how the rubrics were structured. So we saw rubrics that were simply a checklist. Tick this. And so the role of the assessor then is to check compliance. Again, we saw the kind of rubrics very similar to what we had in the last example. But what we did find here was that the question, the criteria were phrased as questions. Did they do this? Is there that in the lesson? And so there's a language of compliance that comes not only in the criteria, but also in the structure of how the rubric is set up.
And now we ask you to think about this one. This is our third image, and we ask you to think about, what do you make of this pattern? When you can see, where is it deeply purple, where are a lot of codes found, and where are no codes found, and well, what is typical of the reasoning teacher? Yes, we come back to that. The rubrics are available to students. Yes.
Well, given we've got limited time, do you want to tell us what you think?
Yeah, okay, we'll go for it. Of course, there is a lot of discrimination, but you can see that the discrimination has moved compared to earlier up to the knowledge dimension. So the discrimination is more often based on a knowledge base. You see the figures on ER plus and ER plus plus were much lower beforehand. So of course, the reasoning teacher is expected to make discriminations about content, but also about context and policy and students. And the implementation part is much lower, of course. Next. Yeah, and you can see the policy is talked about in terms of interpretation, and it's much lower compared to, of course, to the compliant teachers. Next. And the general, you can see, is much lower as well. So we can see when you're comparing these that there are a few different patterns that appears through the use of this framework. And coming back to the men, if we would have put many more categories, of course, if as someone said, if we had 1,000 rubrics, perhaps we would see the pattern even more clearly and be more statistically sure about this. But this is has more the nature of a qualitative description, where we want the distinctions between the categories to be clear enough to be able to say something about what characterizes them, in order to say something about the messages they send to student teachers. Yes, Lee. Yes.
So what was very interesting is that there were no sense in these rubrics, the ones, the two that we looked at, where the disposition was personal and outside of the workplace. Not one example.
We're missing, this was a South African example. Even suggested it was Swedish, and yes, it could have been, but this is a South African example, actually. So.
The Swedish one was very similar yeah. Patterns.
Yes.
And the dispositions that were then valued were the dispositions associated with being a teacher in a work environment, being organized, being committed, being diligent, being collegial. So the structuring of rubrics, we again see this reasoning and the priorities of reasoning coming out in how they're structured. So this is just one example of how knowledge and understanding of the content is structured, and every level is very explicit. So this is you know, the assessors and the students know the difference between what is good and what is very good. It's not just left to the judgment. In one example, the students are working with the same rubric from their first year to their final year. In another example, and that's the Swedish, they get taken on a continuum at different points in their teacher education. But in both of those examples that we had, there was increased attention to knowledge, to reasoning, and to the students' ability to think and reason and do independently over time. So the knowledge and the reasoning permeate through all of those, or nearly all of those criteria. It's a constant refrain. In one example, there was a distinction between a formative and a summative rubric. So this one would have been used for a formative feedback, to give the students an idea of this is where you are and this is where you could be, or this is what you would need to do in order to, you know, to progress. Here's an example of a summative assessment. So you can see it's no longer the arithmetic sum of a whole lot of different values. So 5 levels of knowledge, understanding, and reasoning are defined. So for example, a student who is at a comprehensive level, what they call comprehensive, gives thoughtful consideration to the pedagogic options, makes appropriate choices, there's detailed ongoing reflection, and. So each of those is defined. If one looks then at on the left-hand side, in terms of the visible dimensions of classroom action, the performance and the action, again, 5 levels are defined and described. So as an example, the effective performance and action is learning is mediated effectively, active monitoring of learning understanding. And if one had a student who was found to have comprehensive knowledge, understanding, and reasoning, as well as effective performance and action, the tutors or the assessors would be required to give a mark, a global holistic mark of between 70 and 74, and they would have the discretion, is it a lower or is it a higher? But they would be given this mark range and would allocate a mark in terms of that range.
We have a question from Jennifer. I don't know if you have the time, but I think it deserves a comment. This is an area that needs, perhaps you could put the question, Jennifer. Can we therefore have massive code clashes? No? Do you want to put the question, Jennifer?
There are code clashes. We're going to show you now where the code clashes are. Yeah, so let's get to that. So the implications of the findings, we're going now to the 3rd section of our talk.
I think the first one was yours, Lee.
Oh, was I talking about the convergence?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry, thank you. So we've showed you that there are huge convergences over all the rubrics, and they all acknowledge the importance of subject matter. They all look at the kinds of teaching tasks. They give some indication of the logics for decision making based on content, context, students, and they all give similar dispositions a lot of the time. And this is quite significant because we felt that there are then within countries and between countries shared goods of the practice over these diverse contexts. And that's important for the claim of teaching to become recognized as more of a professional practice. There are views of teaching expressed by theorists like Wilfred Carr and others who say that teaching is so embedded in context and dependent on who you are as a teacher and the interactions and the complexity that there's no ways that teaching as a concept can be abstracted and insights can be transferred across context. Our findings suggest that there's a lot of convergence within the rubrics, but especially in terms of their focus. However, not so much in terms of their basis. The divergences is where the basis of legitimation lie. And we felt that the rubrics, the ones that we analyzed, gave 3 main messages. One was teaching as a whole lot of tasks, and you need to master those tasks. Another strong message from some of them was teaching is about making sure that you comply with doing what is right, procedures, protocols, policy, and so on. And it's about getting it right and doing all those tasks. The third group gave a very strong message that teachers need to reason in relation to what they're teaching, how they're teaching, who they're teaching, where they're teaching, and that the teaching, the practices are informed by principled knowledge and principled strategies, and that the reasoning is really important. Now sorry, Lisa, did you want to add anything there?
No, I think we have to wrap up actually. Yes, people ask if there was a mix, and yes, there was a mix. It was rather the basis was stronger in some, but as you see, there was a spread across the whole plane in all of them, but the emphasis was on one of the ones. So I think we have to skip this one, Lee. Sorry.
Okay.
And just say that as I saw someone noted in the chat, that yes, there's a lot of governing going on in these rubrics, that they can be seen as a significant other, imposing not only the assessment and the assessor, but very much shapes the gaze about what counts for the pre-service teachers. And we do wish you to reflect on, as I can see in the chat that you already do, and if the messages that rubrics send are intentional, if they align with our curriculum goals, but also with our ethical goals for teacher education, if actually the rubrics ask what we want them to ask. And we can just show you the list of previous research on which this is based on before this project started. It's Iben Christiansen, Lisa Österling, and Kiki Skog who built our investigation on much of Lee's previous work. So Lee has been a huge inspiration to us in this work. And I see Carol Bertram is here too, which is also part of this, and Carl, of course.
So Carol and I did, when we looked at the rubrics, we were looking at them in terms of their knowledge categories. So this is revisiting and looking at what does LCT show us that we didn't see before. And with that, we thank you.
Tack så mycket. Thank you for very good comments, and I think we really have to work on the coding transparency one more time when we argue how we did this. Carol.
No, I think that just comes up because if you start with the messages, with the last thing about the three things that are going to, well, not the last one, but the three things that are going to be shown as the hidden messages, then that will be people's focus. And without that, knowing that's coming, then people focus on methodology and analysis. So it's like, it depends on where you put people into the zone. I don't think it's a particularly problematic in terms of the transparency of the code. But thank you, guys. If anybody else wants to chat or ask any questions or whatever, I'm sure that Lisa and Lee will be able to hang around for a bit if you do. Otherwise, I understand and I know that people often have to kick off at this point. So if you do need to go, then thanks for being here, and also thanks to Lisa and Lee for this round table. I always hate this bit because there's like no audible clapping, and then there's all the sorts of little reactions and so on. But I think from the chat, there's been loads and loads of thanks in there, and Mauricio will save the chat and send it to you afterwards as well. Oh, we also have those little emojis as well, like that. And silent clapping.
And we got some questions. Carol, nice to see you.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, great to see you. Hi, Lisa and Lee. Thanks so much. Yeah, I was just thinking, because I was involved in that original research in South Africa, that I think there's also that sense that we have to be careful about thinking that not necessarily all of these rubrics are very consciously designed. And I think this is where the kind of, you know, in some universities they may well be, but I think in other universities they are just kind of mishmashes of what has been done before. A lot of the stuff I think is informed by certainly in South Africa, the size of the student body. You know, certainly at UKZN we have 4,500 students who are on the B.Ed. UNISA has something like 20,000. So there's also that kind of context of the actual institution, I guess, that one has to think about.
Thank you very much, Carol. That was in the slides we didn't have time to talk about. So thank you very
was
much.
it? Okay. But I mean, I think these, you know, I think to make this stuff much more visible is really, really important, because I think certainly in South Africa, we have to have these kinds of discussions about, because I think there is a sense that sometimes these things are just there because they've been there for years. They're very hard to change. You're working with hundreds of different tutors. It's, you know, there's all sorts of practicalities that inform them, as well as this kind of sense of what do we really think teaching is about. So yeah, I think it's a really useful way to open up those discussions. So yeah, thanks so much. Really nice.
That's a really good point,
Thanks.
Carol. But on the other hand, one can also say that the messages are there, however the rubric was created. You know, so
yes, of
like,
course. I mean, I guess there's kind of that sense of just saying, I guess it's like any
this isn't
policy,
an intentional
right?
message. It may not be an
yes,
intentional
it's not
message.
necessarily like it's a conscious sense of saying this is the kind of teacher we want, but I think there are layers and layers. Different people come in and change and shift, and it's like those, you know, those documents are.
And that is also what we think about this translation device and the specialization plane, that it makes us, it is one way of reflecting over what is really the basis of legitimation. My English, sorry.
It's yeah, I guess it's kind of that sense of how much is that it does reflect a habitus and a kind of an unconscious sense sometimes of, and I guess even as teacher educators, we need to do a lot more conscious reflecting on that. I guess that's what it's pointing to.
For me, Carol, the other thing that just to build on your point was, who is the end user? When the rubrics have been designed for the ease of the assessor, checklists, good, you know, not much reading and so on. But what we think has been hidden is the power that these assessment rubrics have to shape the gaze of the developing teacher. And so if one switches to think about that the end user is actually the student teacher who's learning, and what messages are coming through. It's a way of opening up that conversation and saying, are these the right message? You know, are these the messages we want? Are they aligned with our curriculum? And you know, but who's the end user? I think that to me was one of the takeaways from this study.
Karen waved her hand for a while.
Yeah, tack. And thanks. I just wanted to, because I'm still a bit of a beginner, what's the implication that none of them have any elite code in the whole story? Is that irrelevant at this stage for teacher education? Why is there, like for all of them, there's nothing there? And is that important or not?
Yeah.
Okay, so the elite code, the elite code is that the emphasis for achievement, the basis for achievement emphasizes knowledge as well as dispositions at the same time. And these are very, very rare across all fields. And so I don't think that it's actually a problem at all for me. But we did see many shifts between different codes and different strengths. You know, in some parts, the knowledge was emphasized. In other parts, the dispositions were emphasized. In other parts, the tasks were emphasized. But it's very, very rare that they came together. And as I said, the one place that we found it was the respect for diversity that was linked to the use of inclusive pedagogies, you know, where you might, yeah, so that was the one where they were both emphasized, but they were emphasized at the same time. It doesn't mean to say that the knowledge was never emphasized and the dispositions were never emphasized, but they did so in different criteria. It was unusual to find them in the same criteria.
Karin.
Yes, I wanted to come in on exactly that point, and Jack Walton's going to kill me now. But we have been talking about looking at assessing music and engineering performance as two kind of examples on a continuum of practices, that the one is on the one end and the other's on the other because of higher regulation, etc. And the elite code, using specialization, the elite code is so difficult. And I think we haven't problematized what it might be. And it's all hidden in that beautiful word appropriate that you picked up, because there is this underlying, there's a 1 + 1 is more than 2 element in that elite code. So we're experimenting, exploring the whole thing, that it's not just, so you've got these, let's say, knowledge elements that are foregrounded, and you've got these narrow dispositional elements that are foregrounded. There's something else that happens when they come together that actually constitutes what we might mean by an elite code. And we're calling it the X factor. Sorry, Jack. That's our paper, so don't steal it. There's an X factor here that I think the other LCT instruments might help sort of unpack, but it is hidden in those words that I noted that you guys also had doubts about. Things like, what does appropriate really imply? You know, I just wanted to throw that in there. So, and I think that's why in your data, in terms of looking at these rubrics by their very nature can mask that X factor thing that we mean by an elite code.
That's interesting. Mm-hmm.
Can I respond to Joe's? No, Joe. Thanks, Karin. Yeah, certainly they hide and they show, they reveal. That's it. I mean, you know, how does one represent practice? It's an impossible task. But what are the messages that are coming out? That's what, you know, that's what we really did want to see. What was lying under the surface. Jodie's got an interesting question. Jodie, do you want?
Thanks. Sorry, getting tired. I just wanted to clarify the original data set of the rubrics themselves, as what level of education were they across subject areas, because I think I was surprised at the relativist code, but then when I realized that the practicum rubrics, they're potentially having to be transferred across multiple contexts, whatever you're teaching, math, science, English, whatever. Is that accurate to the case, and therefore the rubrics, like,
yes, probably it's difficult to make the content knowledge particularly explicit, but that's also sort of controversial, because the content knowledge was on the ER++. We put it there because and it was content knowledge came through as knowledge in all the rubrics. But it was only mentioned in terms of content knowledge, not more specific than that. But I assume that if rubrics were not that general, I mean, if, for example, if we had rubrics which were more of the field experience kind, where practicum is part of an educational course where they really go out to look at some particular aspects of their teacher education in practicum, we probably would have a different code, more on the ER+ side than on the relativist side. Yes.
Yeah.
But as you say, now they are very general.
To add on to that, all of these were used across elementary, middle school, senior school learners, and across all subjects. So it was the same rubric, that it wasn't, maths high school.
Yeah, exactly. So that's sort of interesting to talk about teachers as the same when it really ranges from 6-year-old children to 60-year-olds, perhaps, if you talk about adult education too. And these were, to make a rubric that counts for everything, that must be very general. Yes, that might be something to think about also.
Yeah, I mean, fundamentally, you've got potential differences in what knowledge is in each of those fields. So therefore, whatever. Thanks.
And I think that was what was so interesting, is that why they were saying it's appropriate for the knowledge, it's appropriate for the learners, it's the appropriate for the knowledge, it's what's relevant for the subject. There were lots, that discretion came very strong in relation to what's important for your subject area or your level of learners.
So next step, semantics and autonomy, clearly.
Lee, can I ask Lisa as well, or just add to that, it's Shoba. The difficulty with the elite code and the fact that it occurs together, the epistemic and the social. And at some point, my study is in numeracy, and at some point you think that, you're asking for the confidence to engage in a process and all of that, and it's elite. And what I think highlighted in your rubric is that there is implicit knowledge and implicit dispositions. And somehow I found that a lot of my numeracy analysis landed in relativist, but it expected a mastery of some knowledges and some an adoption of particular dispositions. But when you assessing practice, or when you're seeing it as practice, it tends to be implicit. It does not, certainly in numeracy. So if I'm looking at nursing and the numeracy happening in nursing, it's not an explicit thing. I see it being practiced, and for that it means that it's implicit. But in its implicitness, it is expecting an acquisition or a competence in specialized knowledge and an adoption of specific dispositions as well. So it's almost as if that elite and relativist code also talk to each other in particular ways. And sometimes, I wanted that to show that it wasn't actually common sense, but the way it came through is that it got placed in relativist, but it expected a whole lot of knowledge and dispositions. And I think it's because we are analyzing practice. Thanks.
That's interesting, because I think also what we coded as ER minus and implicit and outcomes based, there is a lot of knowledge hidden there.
Yeah, but also I think that it's important to notice that one code is not better than the other. It was quite amazing to see that all of them, went through well, certainly the knowledge, the relativist, and the Noah codes. So there was such a good spread across the across all the different codes, but it was where the emphasis lay that was really significant, because that was very different. I think that was one of our big, our big kind of wow when we noticed that. Okay.
Just got one other question talking about relativism. I'm interested about sort of inter-rater reliability from the assessor's point of view. If you've got a very clear rubric and you've got 10 different assessors assessing one student, you often find 3 of them give them a high distinction, 3 give them a distinction, a couple of them might fail them. And I'm just curious, did you find this in your research? I know this is not specifically an LCT question, But that sort of relativism, does it get legitimized as well? How is that sort of noise? I think the terminology they use nowadays, variety, how's that dealt with?
So, Robert, to me, the relativism isn't in the coding. The coding is very, very specific. The coding is quite simply, is knowledge or is dispositions foregrounded here? Where you're talking about, where that comes out is in the level descriptors in the structure of the rubrics. So there's where the students are rated as excellent or very good or good, that's where the inter-assessor reliability goes really, really all over the place. And the students say, oh, it just depends on who sees you.
Sure.
It depends if the lecturer likes you. But it's not in the fact that there were so many in the relativist code. It's really in how explicit are the criteria and how explicit are the different levels. You know, what's the distinction between the different levels of competence? So the ones where the descriptors are very explicit and the levels are very explicit, there's a lot more reliability there than in kind of, you know, is it good? Is it very good? Is it excellent? Well, who knows? That depends on your gaze as the assessor.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's where the sense, the message is that it all just depends. There's no principled grounds why you got a very good and I got a good, because it just depends. Your lecturer liked you more than mine liked me. That's the message.
Yeah, and I agree with, I can see Jodie's comments up. I mean, from a practice point of view, that's infuriating, though for assessor and student. I know this is a separate question, but it is, I'm always curious about how this is dealt with. I've been in some organizations where you do this, and then you sit down and say, why did you give them a high distinction? Let's go through it. And of course, people are beaten to submission and then change their scores. But I sometimes wonder whether the legitimacy of a relativism feel about how we assess things also influences this and perpetuates it until somebody with a bit more power determines what the answer is. But like I said, it's more of a practice-oriented question, which I'm curious about.
Or as Carol was reminding us, you know, we don't have any discussions on the unit I teach on at the moment about any of that, because we've got every single final year undergraduate taking this unit and no clear idea about what the assessment rubrics might be. So just churning them through and giving just enough feedback in relation to the rubric in order to justify whatever mark we've come up with.
Yeah.
So that they shut up and don't keep harassing us about what mark they've got. Sheer, you know, sheer numbers means that your discussion of like your description of like people arguing about it would be just simply would never happen in the unit I'm teaching on at the moment, simply because of its giant size.
But I actually just on that point, and this is a very personal anecdote. That's interesting. I'm teaching a subject now with 6 students. It's just me. So I have, you know, all the women in my world. I write my own rubrics, and if they're actually assessed through the university's policies, they'll probably be struck out because they're far more individualistic than they used to. But at an organization which was highly accountable to students, I know they all are now, in the sense that it's all their money and there's got no funding from elsewhere, we did have 10 of us marking 400 students in a law degree and going through those papers 80 at a time. And I think that reflects, again, this is more of the ideological structure of the organization. There was the legitimate process to do that because it felt more accountable, because they would lose out if students started knowing what was happening.
And at my university, that's been possible in the past due to systematic wage theft on casuals. And now they're saying no. So now we don't do any of that. So it's like, it's really interesting to see how which codes, I mean, that's not to say that we're still not pumping out propaganda of one code whilst doing another. So, I mean, there's also the, you know, the difference between the rhetoric and the reality as well. But I mean, I think it's really interesting that the point of this paper, I think, is that what message is the rubric giving in itself, regardless of how good that rubric is or whether it's accurate or inaccurate or whatever. What is the message? Is it that doing whatever you're being taught is a bunch of practical skills, kind of a bag of tricks, or is it a set of principles, or is it a set of dispositions, or is it a bunch of those different things? And I think that is a message that as part of the message system, as Basil called it, what is it that we're subtly putting out there as being what this thing is all about? For us, it's a bunch of content. Did you include this and did you include that in the unit I'm teaching currently?
I agree, and that was what we thought too, because someone wrote in the chat here whether LCT could be a way of assessing rubrics, and in a way, I think the strength in it is that it reveals the basis for legitimation, whereas the content, the focus needs to be. I mean, we have to take a stand as assessors what we want from the rubrics. If it is elite code, perhaps, but I'm not sure. So perhaps we're happy with the compliant teacher, and then we must be happy with the rubrics we have. But if we want something different, this could be a way of assessing it. I assume that some people want compliant teachers too, and that there is a very good reason behind this sort of rubric.
Absolutely,
Although
absolutely.
perhaps I assume you can hear both Lee and I prefer something different, but
yeah, but that's the great thing about LCT, is that it doesn't offer a single theory about anything. It's just tools to use to generate projectors. So, for example, there's been many situations in history and around the world right now where compliant teachers are very much what they want, regardless of whether we like that or not. So well, thanks everybody. There's loads of comments in the chat that I'm sure that you two will want to have a scroll through and maybe engage with people either individually or through the email forum. So thanks everyone for hanging around for even more kind of like chat afterwards. And I hope to see you in 2 weeks' time. Thanks to Lisa and to Lee.
Thank you. Thanks everybody. Thanks, Carl.
Thanks so
much. I'll see you all in 2 weeks, I hope.
Cheers.